The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. I watched Helen Kraft, our CTO, tap her pen against the glass table, 3 quick beats, pause, 3 more. She'd been doing it for 2 minutes while I waited for her to say whatever she'd called me in to say. The system redesign document sat between us, my notes covering every page in that precise handwriting I'd developed over 6 years of architecture work. Adley. She finally looked up. I'm making a change to the redesign team structure. My stomach dropped before my brain caught up. What kind of change? I'm pulling you off lead. Putting you in a support role. She glanced toward the door, and I followed her gaze to see Colin standing there, laptop under one arm, that easy smile already spreading across his face. He codes faster than you, Helen said, the words flat and final. She nodded at him like she was presenting evidence in court. We need velocity right now. The air left my lungs in a way I hope she didn't notice. 6 years. I'd spent 6 years building Century Technologies' infrastructure from a rickety mess of legacy systems into something stable. I'd been the one who mapped every dependency, documented every integration point, planned every migration path for this redesign. Colin had been here 8 months. I see. The words came out steady, which surprised me. When does the transition happen? Immediately. Colin's already reviewed your documentation. You'll assist as needed. I stood, collected my documents with hands that somehow weren't shaking, and walked past Colin without meeting his eyes. He said something, probably hello, probably friendly, but it sounded like it was coming through water. The walk back to my desk felt longer than usual. Around me, the office buzzed with its typical mid-afternoon energy. Developers hunched over dual monitors, product managers clustered around whiteboards sketching user flows, the distant hum of the HVAC system providing white noise to it all. Everything looked exactly as it had 15 minutes ago, but the ground beneath my feet had fundamentally shifted. I sat down and opened my email, where 3 new messages already waited. One from Simone in QA asking about test environment access. One from the operations team flagging a performance degradation they needed help diagnosing. One from a junior developer who'd been relying on my weekly code review sessions to level up his skills. All of them assumed I was still the person who solved their problems. I'd expected the reassignment would hurt. I hadn't expected it to feel like theft. That first afternoon, I sat at my desk staring at my screen while Colin held court in the same conference room, explaining my architecture to the team I'd built. Through the glass walls, I could see him gesturing at the whiteboard where my diagrams still lingered in blue marker. Helen stood beside him, nodding, occasionally interjecting with questions I'd already answered in the documentation he was clearly paraphrasing. Velocity. That's what she'd said we needed. What she'd meant was, your carefulness looks like slowness. Your thoroughness reads as hesitation. The fact that you haven't caused a production incident in 3 years doesn't matter as much as his confidence in meetings. The system I'd designed wasn't just code. It was years of institutional knowledge, patterns learned from failures, safeguards built from experience. I'd spent countless hours making sure migrations could be rolled back, that monitoring would catch issues before customers noticed, that the architecture could scale when the business needed it to. All of that careful planning had been dismissed as over-engineering by someone who'd never stayed up until 3 in the morning recovering from a catastrophic deployment. I pulled up my calendar and looked at the next 6 weeks. Every morning started at 7 because I'd been debugging issues the night team escalated. Every evening ran past 8 because I'd been covering the gaps while we were understaffed. Lunch breaks had become a theoretical concept sometime last spring. I'd been doing this, overextending, compensating, catching everyone else's mistakes, for so long that I'd forgotten it wasn't in my job description. My phone buzzed. A message from Simone in QA, hey, Colin's asking about the database migration rollback plan. Can you send him your notes? I looked at that message for a long time. Then I typed back, everything's in the documentation folder. Section 7. I didn't add the explanation. Didn't offer to walk him through it. Didn't schedule a call to make sure he understood the dependencies. Just sent him to the document I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting, and closed Slack. Something shifted in my chest. Not rage would have been hot and immediate. This was colder. Clearer. A door closing quietly on a room I'd been standing in too long. I'd been operating under rules nobody else followed, be invaluable, and you'll be valued. Work harder than everyone, and eventually they'll notice. Sacrifice your boundaries, and the company will protect you in return. Helen had just shown me how much that currency was worth. I opened a fresh document and wrote 3 lines. Work your hours. Let other people solve their own problems. Stop treating urgency as your default state. Then I set my alarm for 8:45 a.m. instead of 6:30, and went home at exactly 5 p.m. for the first time in memory. The subway ride home felt surreal. I'd taken this route thousands of times, but usually after dark, usually exhausted, usually already thinking about what fires I'd need to put out the next morning. Now the evening commute was packed with people in business casual, tourists consulting their phones, students with backpacks heading to night classes. A whole world of people who left work at reasonable hours and didn't think twice about it. When I unlocked my apartment door, Kai was in the kitchen. He turned, surprised. You're home. It's not even 6. Are you sick? No. Just on time for once. He studied my face. Something happened. I'll tell you over dinner. I hung up my coat, feeling the weight of the day settle into my shoulders. But first I need to change out of these clothes and remember what it feels like to be a person instead of a resource. The next morning, I arrived at 9. Not late, 9 was the official start time, but for me, unprecedented. My desk had a stack of sticky notes from the night team, each one a small crisis that would have had me on Slack at midnight a week ago. I peeled them off one by one and dropped them in the recycling bin. The office was already busy, that frantic energy that comes from people who've been putting out fires since dawn. I booted up my computer, made myself coffee, and settled into work on the backlog I'd been neglecting for months while handling everyone else's emergencies. At 9:47, Colin appeared at my desk, his smile strained around the edges. Hey, so, I'm hitting a weird issue with the authentication service migration. I know you set up the original integration, can you take a look? I glanced at my current task, a routine code review that had been on my plate for 2 weeks because everyone else's fires had taken priority. I'm focused on something else right now. Have you checked the service documentation? His smile faltered. I did, but it's not making sense. Could you just? The integration patterns are all documented in the wiki. Section on OAuth flows. I turned back to my screen. If there's a gap in the documentation, let me know and I'll add it to the backlog. He stood there for another 5 seconds before walking away. I felt his confusion like static electricity, but I didn't turn around. At 10:30, one of the platform engineers stopped by. Adley, quick question about the caching layer. We're seeing some inconsistent behavior. Have you opened a ticket? He blinked. Well, no, I thought I'd just ask you since you built it. Open a ticket with the details and assign it to the platform team queue. Someone will triage it. I kept my eyes on my code review. That's the process. By lunch, 2 more people had stopped by with quick questions that would have eaten my afternoon. I redirected them to documentation, to each other, to Helen. The word no, or its professional equivalent, came easier each time. The afternoon brought a team meeting where Colin presented his modified timeline for the redesign. I listened as he explained his approach, noting the places where he'd simplified things I'd deliberately made complex for good reason. Redundant failover systems dismissed as unnecessary. Gradual migration phases collapsed into a big bang deployment. Testing cycles cut in half to hit his aggressive deadlines. Other people in the room nodded along. They trusted his confidence. Nobody asked me for my opinion, so I didn't offer it. After the meeting, one of the senior developers pulled me aside in the hallway. That rollout schedule seems aggressive. What do you think? I think Colin's the lead architect. He's made his decision. But you know the system. I documented everything I know. If something's unclear, he should ask questions. I started walking toward my desk. I'm not on the redesign team anymore. You should direct your concerns to Helen. At 5:01 p.m., I logged off while 3 Slack messages sat unread in channels I'd previously monitored obsessively. The office was still humming with activity. Colin was still in the conference room, now on a video call with someone, his forehead creased in concentration. I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, but I pushed it down and walked to the elevator. The evening air hit my face on the street, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd left work while the sun was still up. By Thursday, a pattern had established itself. People kept expecting me to function as I always had, the safety net, the institutional memory, the person who fixed things before they broke. And I kept not doing that. Simone cornered me in the kitchen while I was making tea. "Adley, I need your input on the QA environment setup. Colin's saying we can skip the staging phase, but that doesn't sound right. You should escalate that to Helen." I poured hot water over the tea bag, watching it steep. "She's the decision maker now. But you know the system. Colin's the lead architect. He should have the answer." The words came out gentle but immovable. "If he doesn't, that's something Helen needs to know." Simone's expression cycled through confusion, frustration, and finally something like understanding. She nodded slowly and left without another word. At my desk, the Slack channels I'd once moderated were descending into chaos. Questions about system behavior went unanswered for hours. Someone deployed a change to the wrong environment because the runbook I'd maintained hadn't been updated by whoever took over that responsibility. Nobody had taken over that responsibility. The assumption had been that I'd keep doing it anyway. I watched it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment, like observing weather from inside a sealed building. Part of me still itched to step in, to prevent the small disasters that were compounding into larger ones. But I'd spent 6 years preventing disasters, and the reward had been to have my expertise dismissed as insufficient. They could have the velocity they wanted. They'd learn what it cost. The most fascinating part was watching how quickly things unraveled. Systems I'd maintained through constant vigilance began showing cracks. The monitoring dashboards I'd set up were still working, but nobody was reading them the way I had, spotting patterns before they became problems. The documentation I'd written was comprehensive, but it assumed readers would invest time in understanding context. Colin's approach was to skim for the specific answer he needed right now, missing the interconnected reasons why things worked the way they did. By Thursday afternoon, 3 separate incidents had required rollbacks. Small things, configuration errors, timing issues, misunderstood dependencies. The kind of mistakes I would have caught in code review or prevented with a 5-minute conversation. But I wasn't doing code reviews for the redesign team anymore, and the 5-minute conversations had dried up after I'd redirected people to documentation a few times. Friday evening, I came home to find Kai in the kitchen, already halfway through dinner prep. The smell of garlic and ginger filled our apartment, warm and ordinary in a way that made my throat tight. "You're home early again." He looked up from chopping vegetables, his face brightening. 3 days in a row. "Is this real, or are you going to tell me you have to log on after dinner?" "It's real." I dropped my bag by the door and crossed to him, wrapping my arms around his waist from behind. He was solid and warm, and I pressed my forehead against his shoulder blade. "I'm actually home." "What happened?" His hand stilled on the cutting board. "The last time you were home before 7 on a weekday, I think we were still dating." I'd been avoiding this conversation, but Kai had earned the truth. I pulled back and leaned against the counter. "Helen pulled me off the system redesign. Put some newer guy in charge because he codes faster." The knife hit the cutting board harder than necessary. "She what?" "It's fine. I'm handling it." "Handling it how?" He turned to face me fully. "Because you've been getting home at reasonable hours, which I love, but you also have that look." "What look?" "The one where you're deciding something and not telling me what it is." He wiped his hands on a towel. "Talk to me." So I did. I told him about the reassignment, about the years of overwork, about the decision I'd made to stop carrying weight that wasn't mine. He listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from anger to concern to something I couldn't quite name. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Then, how much of your life has this job taken?" The question landed like a physical thing. "What do you mean?" "I mean..." He gestured vaguely. "When's the last time we took a vacation? When's the last time you read a book for fun, or we had people over, or you weren't checking your phone during dinner?" His voice was gentle, but every word cut. "When's the last time you seemed happy?" I opened my mouth and found I had no answer. "I'm not trying to make you feel guilty," Kai continued. "I'm asking because I've been watching you disappear into that place for years, and I've been telling myself it would get better. That eventually they'd recognize what you were doing and it would be worth it." He took my hands. "But they didn't, did they? And now you're finally setting boundaries, And I'm terrified you'll talk yourself out of it because that's what you do. You'll convince yourself they need you. They do need me. Maybe. But do you need them? The question sat between us in the kitchen, suspended in the smell of dinner and the soft light from the window. Outside, the city moved along without urgency, people heading home to their own lives, their own choices about what to give and what to keep. I didn't have an answer for Kai. But the question stayed with me through dinner, through the evening we spent on the couch watching movies I'd been too tired to focus on for months, through the night when I lay awake staring at the ceiling and cataloging all the ways I'd let century technologies consume me. When had I last felt excited about my work instead of just grimly determined to survive it? When had I last learned something new instead of endlessly applying the same expertise to fix the same recurring problems? When had I last felt like the company valued my judgment instead of just my productivity? I couldn't pinpoint the moment it had all gone wrong. It had been gradual, a slow erosion of boundaries and a steady accumulation of responsibilities that were never formally mine but somehow became my problem. The first time I'd stayed late to fix someone else's mistake. The first time I'd skipped lunch to help a colleague debug their code. The first time I'd checked Slack on a Saturday morning just in case. Each individual choice had seemed reasonable. Taken together, they'd built a prison I'd walked into one small compromise at a time. Monday morning arrived with an email marked urgent. Helen wanted to see me at 10 a.m. I showed up at 10:03. Not defiant, just no longer operating on the assumption that her time was more valuable than mine. She was standing when I entered, her posture rigid in a way that suggested she'd been on back-to-back calls all morning. Close the door. I did, then sat without waiting for an invitation. Small things, but they felt monumental. We have a situation. Helen's voice was controlled, but I could hear the stress underneath. Production went down Friday night. Completely down. We lost 6 hours of service before we could recover. I kept my expression neutral and waited. She clearly had more to say. Colin's migration strategy bypassed several safety checks she'd built into the process. He thought they were slowing things down. She paused. He was wrong. I see. We had to roll back everything. 3 weeks of work, gone. And we're still dealing with data inconsistencies from the attempted migration. She sat down heavily. The executive team is furious. Our SLA guarantees are in jeopardy. We might lose the Meridian contract over this. The name hit me. Meridian was our largest client, accounting for nearly 30% of revenue. Losing them would mean layoffs, potentially significant ones. I need you back on the redesign. As lead architect. There it was. The recognition I'd wanted 3 weeks ago, offered now that disaster had proven my worth. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt tired. What changed? I asked. Helen blinked. What do you mean? 3 weeks ago, I wasn't fast enough. Today I am. What changed about my capabilities in that time? Adley. Because my skills didn't change. My knowledge didn't change. The only thing that changed is that you're now experiencing the consequences of not having me do the work I was already doing. I kept my voice level. So I'm asking, what's different? She stared at me like I'd started speaking another language. In 6 years, I'd never questioned her directly. I'd been the reliable one, the one who absorbed criticism and worked harder. This isn't about assigning blame, Helen said finally. It's about fixing the situation. By putting things back the way they were? Where I do the work while someone else gets the credit and the authority? That's not how. She stopped, reconsidered. What do you want? It was the first time she'd asked me that in 6 years. The question hung in the air between us. I realized I hadn't prepared for this moment, hadn't scripted what I'd say. But the answer came easily, built from a week of working reasonable hours and coming home to Kai and remembering what it felt like to have a life outside these walls. I want to think about it, I said. I'll have an answer for you Wednesday. I left before she could respond, my heart hammering but my stride steady. That evening, I met my friend Zoe at the wine bar near my apartment. She'd been a project manager at Century before leaving for a startup, and she'd heard enough of my work stories over the years to qualify as an expert witness. Let me get this straight. Zoe swirled her glass, eyebrows raised. She demoted you, the company nearly imploded without you, and now she wants you to come back and save them? Essentially. And you said you'd think about it? She laughed. Adley Lawson, setting boundaries. I never thought I'd see the day. What happened to the woman who once worked through the flu because the deployment couldn't wait? She got tired of being undervalued. I took a long sip of wine. But I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to go back just to prove I was right all along. Part of me wants to walk away and let them fail. Both of those are revenge fantasies. Zoe leaned forward. What do you actually want? Not what would feel good for 5 minutes. What would make you happy 6 months from now? I turned the glass in my hands, watching the light refract through the red wine. I want to do the work I'm good at. I want to be respected for it. I want to go home at 5 o'clock and not feel guilty. Then that's what you ask for. Not a return to the old arrangement with a fancier title. Real structural change. She pointed at me with her glass. You have leverage now. They're in crisis, they know Colin can't fix it, and you're the only one who can. Don't waste that leverage on feeling vindicated. Use it to build something better. What if they say no? Then you leave, and you'll be fine. But I bet they won't say no. They're desperate. Zoe grinned. And even if they do, you'll have learned something important. That place doesn't deserve you. We spent the next hour talking through scenarios. Zoe had negotiated her way out of Century and into a role with equity, flexible hours, and actual respect for her expertise. She knew what was possible when you stopped accepting the first offer and started advocating for yourself. The key is specificity, she said. Don't just ask for better work-life balance. Define exactly what that means. Hours you will and won't work. On-call rotation limits. Vacation time you'll actually take. Put it all in writing. That feels aggressive. That feels like respecting yourself. Zoe finished her wine. They've been taking advantage of your dedication for years. The fact that it feels aggressive to ask for reasonable treatment is exactly the problem. I left the bar with my mind clearer than it had been in weeks. Not because Zoe had given me answers, but because she'd asked the right questions. Wednesday at 9, I walked into Helen's office with a document. 3 pages, single-spaced, outlining the conditions under which I'd return to the redesign. She read it in silence while I waited. I watched her expression shift from curiosity to surprise to something that might have been respect. You want final say on all architectural decisions, she said slowly. Direct reporting relationship to you, not through me. Dedicated budget for infrastructure improvements. And, she looked up. A 20% raise. That reflects the market rate for someone with my experience and specialization. I checked. This is comprehensive. You asked what I wanted. That's what I want. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my voice even. I'm not interested in symbolic gestures. I'm not interested in a better title without actual authority. If you need me to fix this, these are the terms. Helen set the document down. You know Colin's going to have feelings about reporting to you. Colin can have all the feelings he wants. But he'll need to earn the trust one built over 6 years, and that won't happen overnight. I paused. If he's as talented as you thought he was, he'll figure it out. If he's not, you should know that sooner rather than later. This is a significant shift in power dynamics. Yes. That's the point. I met her eyes. You moved me aside because you thought speed mattered more than correctness. You learned you were wrong. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about creating a structure where the same mistake can't happen again. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming on the desk in that same 3-beat pattern. Then she picked up her pen and signed the bottom of the last page. You have a deal. HR will process everything by end of week. I took the document, now with her signature, and stood. I'll start the recovery plan today. Colin can attend the meetings, but I'll be leading them. Adley. She stopped me at the door. For what it's worth, I should have handled things differently 3 weeks ago. I considered the apology, weighed it against 6 years of being overlooked, and decided it didn't tip the scales much. But I nodded anyway. Thank you for saying that. By Friday afternoon, I'd assembled the team, outlined the recovery roadmap, and begun the careful work of untangling the damage from the rushed migration. Colin sat in the meetings, quieter than I'd seen him, occasionally contributing ideas that showed he was learning. The recovery plan was methodical. First, stabilize the current system and ensure no further degradation. Second, assess the data inconsistencies and develop a correction strategy. Third, rebuild trust with the operations team who'd been burned by the failed deployment. Fourth, redesign the migration approach with proper safety measures. Each phase had clear milestones, explicit rollback procedures, and realistic timelines that didn't sacrifice correctness for speed. After the third meeting, he caught me at my desk. "Can we talk?" I saved my work and gestured to the empty chair. "Sure. I want to apologize." He looked uncomfortable but sincere. I thought I understood the system better than I did. I made assumptions, and people got hurt by them. The operations team lost sleep. The support team dealt with angry customers. All because I was too proud to admit I needed help. I didn't try very hard to help, I admitted. I was angry, and I let you fail instead of helping you succeed. You didn't let me fail. I failed on my own. He rubbed the back of his neck. Helen told me about the new structure. You reporting to her, me reporting to you. I get why that makes sense, but I want you to know I'm not going to make this difficult. I want to learn from you if you'll let me. I studied him for a moment. Younger than me, confident in the way people are when they've succeeded quickly, but with enough self-awareness to recognize when he's out of his depth. Not a bad person. Just someone who'd been given authority without the experience to back it up, in a system that rewarded swagger over substance. Here's what I need from you, I said. When I explain why something matters, I need you to trust that I have reasons. When I ask you to slow down, I need you to understand that's not the same as stopping. And when you don't know something, I need you to admit it instead of guessing. I can do that. Then we'll be fine. I turned back to my screen. Read section 12 of the redesign doc by Monday. We'll go through it together. He left looking relieved, and I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness, that would take time. But the possibility of working together without carrying resentment like a stone. 2 weeks later, I walked into Helen's office for our regular check-in to find Diane Wolfe waiting there. Diane was Century's CEO, someone I'd maybe spoken to 3 times in 6 years, always in passing. Adley. Diane stood and offered her hand. I've been hearing about the recovery work. Helen tells me you pulled off something close to a miracle. Just doing the job. I shook her hand, confused about why she was here. That's part of what I wanted to talk about. Diane gestured for me to sit. We're restructuring the engineering division. Creating a VP of infrastructure role to have oversight of all our platform work. After watching how you handled this crisis, I'd like to offer you the position. The words took a moment to process. VP. That was 2 levels above where I'd been 3 weeks ago. We need someone who understands the technical depth and can make strategic decisions, Diane continued. Someone the engineers trust because they've done the work. Helen recommended you, and after reviewing your track record, I agree. I glanced at Helen, who nodded confirmation. The role comes with a team, real budget authority, and a seat in strategic planning meetings. You'd be building the infrastructure vision for the company's next 5 years. It was everything I'd wanted and hadn't known how to ask for. But I'd learned something in the past month about accepting opportunities without examining the conditions. Can I see the full role description and reporting structure? I asked. I'd want to understand the scope before I commit. Of course. Diane pulled out a folder. Take your time reviewing it. But I hope you'll consider it seriously. You've proven you have the capability. The question is whether you want it. That night, I spread the role documents across the dining table while Kai made dinner. He kept glancing over, clearly curious but giving me space to think. They offered me VP of infrastructure, I said finally. Kai nearly dropped the spatula. That's incredible. Wait. You don't look happy. Should I be worried? I'm not unhappy. I'm just being careful. I pushed the papers toward him. I spent 6 years being undervalued. Then 3 weeks proving my worth through malicious compliance. Now they want to promote me 2 levels. And you're wondering if it's real or if they're just desperate? Partly. But also. I struggled to articulate it. What if I take this role and end up right back where I was? Working 80-hour weeks, sacrificing everything, because the company needs it and I'm the only one who can deliver? Kai sat down across from me. Then don't do that. You have leverage now. You have a track record of setting boundaries. Use both. He tapped the documents. What does the role description say about work-life balance? Nothing explicit. Then make it explicit. You're negotiating terms before accepting, right? I nodded slowly. The idea was taking shape. Not just accepting the role as offered, but shaping it into something sustainable. Something that didn't require me to martyr myself to be successful. I could set parameters, I said, thinking out loud. Clear expectations about hours, team support, decision-making authority that prevents the kind of override that happened with Colin. Exactly. Kai smiled. You're not the same person who got demoted 3 weeks ago. Don't negotiate like you are. Monday morning, I met with Diane and Helen together. I'd spent the weekend refining my conditions, and I presented them with the same clarity I'd used in the initial negotiation. I'll accept the VP role under these terms. I need hiring authority to build a team that can distribute the workload properly. I need explicit boundaries in my contract about on-call expectations and work hours. I'll be available for genuine emergencies, but we need to stop treating urgency as the default state. And I need a seat at the table when strategic decisions get made that affect infrastructure, not just implementation authority after the fact. Diane listened without interrupting. When I finished, she glanced at Helen, then back to me. These are reasonable requests. Some of them should have been standard in the first place. They should have, I agreed. But they weren't. So I'm making them explicit now. I appreciate the directness. Diane pulled out her copy of the role description and made notes in the margin. I'll have legal draft the contract with these provisions. Anything else? One more thing. I want Colin to transition into a senior architect role under my organization. He has potential, but he needs mentorship and oversight. If I'm building this team, I want people who can learn from mistakes, not people who repeat them because no one stopped them. Helen looked surprised, but Diane nodded approvingly. That's good leadership thinking. Consider it done. We shook hands, and I left the office with a role that was defined on my terms, not just their needs.